Hey everybody, Ben here from DMC Films and Cineblock Studios, and it's everything you need to know about watercolors. The remake, it's longer, I'm gonna get it done as fast as I can, but I don't know how short it's gonna be, to be honest. So what is it that makes watercolors different than other types of paints, like oils, acrylics, or whatever? As I've mentioned in this series before, paint is made with three main ingredients: pigment, binder, and stabilizer. And the binder for each paint is what gives its paint either its name or its consistency to call it watercolor, oil, or acrylic. For watercolor, your binder is either going to be Aquazol or gum arabic, which is a little more common. And unlike other painting mediums, watercolors can be reactivated just by simply adding water to them. It's also a transparent medium, or at least has different levels of transparency. So rather than painting and just having your paint block out all of the other color that was underneath it before, watercolor doesn't necessarily do that. But it doesn't do that in a good way. So let's talk now about the three main types of watercolors: pan or cake watercolors, tubes, and concentrated. First up is pan or cake watercolors. Now most of these you're probably familiar with in terms of a company like Crayola, who made something like this, and you probably used these growing up. While pan and cake watercolors aren't simply a cheap thing you use when you're a kid, they do sell professional ones, and usually they're the best choice for a budget-oriented painter. Pan or cake watercolors will start in their dry state, and you can decide how intense that color becomes. For that reason, they're often really good for travel. Next up, you have tube watercolors. Now these are a little less common than the pan or cake watercolors, but they are still very common, and if you're an artist who's more traditionally studio-minded, these are the ones you're probably going to be using. Tube watercolors often don't last quite as long as the pan and cake watercolors, but oftentimes you're going to get a lot more intense color out of them. Additionally, if you love working in a slightly thicker consistency, regardless of watercolors, acrylics, whatever, you're going to definitely like tube watercolors because you have that flexibility. And in working thicker, it really helps to be able to add that extra bit of detail to your pieces. Finally, there's concentrated watercolors. Now, I don't have any of these in the studio, but the best comparable thing I can show you is a bottle of acrylic ink, because that's about the same kind of bottle that you'll get out of a concentrated watercolor. Now, concentrated watercolors are a bit more limited, they're less common, and only available in a handful of brands. They have an ink-like consistency, and the colors are often very intense. They can be really good if you want your paints to last a really long time, since you don't need a lot of the color to really go a long way. However, the initial investment for concentrated watercolors is a little bit higher than your standard pan, cake, or tube watercolors. So concentrated tube and cakes are the main types of watercolor, but there is actually a fourth category, and it kind of bleeds into being its own medium, and that's gouache. Gouache, in addition to being a strange word to both say and spell, is still watercolor in that you can reactivate it with water. It's still a gum arabic based product, but rather than being a transparent medium, it's opaque. One of the biggest differences between regular watercolor and gouache is the color shift. Gouache, a lighter color of it, will dry darker than the paint itself, and the darker colors in gouache will dry lighter. This can make a little bit of a challenge between just using it straight out of the tube or mixing it with other colors and other paints. I'm just getting into gouache right now myself, but I can easily say that having worked with watercolors for a long time, I feel like gouache is everything that watercolor should be. But this is probably more so that I'm coming from acrylic, and I just really am used to opaque paint. And another thing to note between this idea of gouache is opaque and watercolor is transparent, while that is mostly true, keep in mind that in watercolor there are three grades of transparency. These three transparent grades are more dominant in artist and professional grade watercolors, and you won't see them as much in student grade, but they are simply transparent, semi-transparent, and semi-opaque. And these three variants of transparent, semi-transparent, and semi-opaque are going to depend on which color you're using and not which quality or which brand. But we'll talk a little bit more about this later. So with acrylics you get mediums and gels, but what about watercolors? Do you get other mediums and gels or additives? What are the different things that you can put into watercolors or use on top of them to really kind of change what they do? The first one here might surprise you. It's just regular table salt. Actually, this is coarse kosher salt, but it does work just the same. This could be used to create interesting special effects, basically to create resist techniques, but in very specific areas. Moving from a resist technique to a straight up the watercolor doesn't go here technique, you can pick up some masking fluid, which is perfect for adding simple, fine details and keeping areas of your paper white longer, and then peeling that off later to use a different color there that wouldn't be polluted by any underlying color. There's also Oxgall. Now this stuff is synthetic and made by Core, but it works just the same in that it improves wetting capabilities and breaks the surface tension of your water. You can also pick up additional binder like gum arabic or aquazol to mix in with your watercolor paints to improve transparency, wetting capabilities, color vibrancy, and just the general gloss of the paint itself, in a similar way that you might use linseed oil for oil paints. And finally, there's water, which is just your basic mixing agent. Of course, you can also use water with a paper towel to literally lift paint right off of your page. Okay, so that's enough about the paint itself. What about the surfaces you can paint on? For the most part, you're looking at different types of paper and board. The most common type of paper is simply just called watercolor paper. In my Everything You Need to Know About Art Papers video, I discussed the 3 different types of watercolor paper: cold press, hot press, and rough. Cold press has a nice medium texture and is good both for beginners and professionals just looking for a nice all-around watercolor paper. While hot press tends to give you a little bit smoother a surface, and rough is, as the name suggests, a little rougher of a surface. Rough paper isn't as good for detailing, but it is good for more abstract-minded painters. But regardless of which paper you're using, it's important to either keep the paper in a block the way it comes, or if you're using individual sheets, to stretch it down on your table. Stretching watercolor paper isn't quite as intense as perhaps stretching a canvas, but it is vitally important to your process. To stretch watercolor paper, all you simply need is a bit of masking tape. Taping down your edges, or simply called stretching your watercolor paper, is a great way to keep your paper from buckling, as well to help maintain flow of your watercolors. Note that I'm taping the opposite edges at a time. This is really important and maintains a proper stretch of the paper itself. A few other good alternatives are a company named Ampersand that makes stuff called Aquaboard. I did a little painting a couple of years ago on a piece of that's here. It tends to be a little bit similar to a rough watercolor paper. I also love using some of the Golden's Fine Pumice Gel. It's an acrylic medium, but it's can really be used to create a transparent ground that really accepts watercolors very well. Alright, we got paint and paper covered, but what about brushes? Generally speaking, when using watercolors, you want something with a short handle and soft bristles. The soft hair of the bristles is to absorb more water and more color. And the short handles is specifically because in most cases you're working either on a flat table or surface or just very close to your working environment. You don't see too many watercolor artists that kind of step back and play like this. So if you already have a few coarse-haired brushes that you use for oils or acrylics, don't use them for your watercolors because usually they're pretty ineffective and won't pick up the water. However, if you're using gouache, sometimes you can bend those rules a little bit. If you're looking for a good suggestion of a solid watercolor brush, a lot of watercolorists love sable brushes, and they'll just swear by them constantly, mostly because they hold a ton of water and keep a really nice point. However, sable brushes are really expensive. Alright, so let's dive into a few basic techniques. The first technique is wet on wet. Wet on wet watercolor is usually the best way to lay down your base color. You're putting water down on the paper first, and then adding a mix of both the watercolor and a little bit extra water into the watercolor just to get a nice sort of stain down on your page. Wet on dry is a great way to add detail, and if you're a design-oriented painter, this is usually how you want to paint from the start. It's important to note for wet on dry to work on top of a wet on wet technique, you have to let that wet on wet technique dry first. This is a mistake a lot of people make when they first start using watercolors, but it's not a big deal. Just make sure to let your paper dry. If you feel it to the touch and it's cold, it's still wet, let it dry. Then you can do a wet on dry technique over top of that and really add some nice detail. Another great technique is to use a subtractive method to create perhaps interesting textured effects. In this example, I'm using Kleenex just to kind of lift some paint off the page and almost create something that looks a bit like a cloud. Additionally, you can use salt, as I mentioned before, to create an interesting resist technique. As long as I've got my watercolors out, I do want to show you the difference between those 3 types of watercolors: transparent, semi-transparent, and semi-opaque. The first color I'm laying down here is some cerulean blue pure. Now, a lot of times when people are using cerulean blue, they're using a cerulean blue chromium or deep, just because they have a more opaque color to them. Cerulean Blue Pure, however, is a very transparent watercolor as well as a very transparent color really in any medium you choose. For this reason, it's a great example of true transparent watercolor. The blue I was using for the rest of this demo was Prussian Blue. It's a really good middle ground in terms of opacity. It's a great one that you can definitely call a semi-transparent. And the final color is a semi-opaque. This one is some indigo blue, and it's just a beautiful color, and I just love how dark it is. Great example of a semi-opaque watercolor. And you can see very clearly the three together are very different opacities, but all still watercolor. Now, if you've seen my videos before, you probably know that I'm somebody who really believes that quality, and a lot of times, really does matter. Now, for watercolors, it's actually kind of interesting because it goes a little bit both ways. In watercolors, a good quality paper and paint can really make all the difference in the world. But if you gotta cut costs somewhere, a cheaper watercolor, you can actually make do with. Even I use my old Crayola packs from time to time for certain projects, and you know what? They work pretty well. Now, they may not be super archival, but, you know, it gets the job done. And from what I've found in just trying different types of watercolor materials, is that the paper is probably the one thing that matters the most. A coarser paper is going to hold a little bit more water. A smoother hot press, maybe not so much water, but the quality actually does really kind of make a difference. As much as it pains me to say it, you can use a cheap paint on expensive watercolor paper and it looks fine. Now that's a lot of information, so let's break down the pros and the cons. On the pro side, when you're looking at the big three types of paint, watercolor, acrylic, and oils, watercolors are the cheapest of those three. They're a pretty accessible paint medium to learn, and there's lots of room to grow. Plus, it's perfect for mixed media applications. Additionally, most watercolors won't stain your clothes. So, I mean, granted, some of this has to do with which pigments are used, but for the most part, if you're worried about staining and getting paint all over everything you own, watercolors might be a good choice for you. Along that same lines of staining though, if your watercolors say non-liftable, then it's going to stain your clothes. Watercolors are also a really great wet media for travel. I know a lot of watercolor artists that will use a small travel pack of cake watercolors as well as a water brush, just so they can really do some crazy things with color while they're on the go. On the downside though, watercolors can get muddy pretty fast. If you don't really take your time with them and you just keep adding water, keep adding color, and you don't let your layers dry as you kind of need to with any type of paint, things can get pretty brown and black and disgusting pretty quick. For this reason, while watercolors are a great medium for beginners, they can be tricky to master as a professional. And unlike other types of paints, there are a limited number of supports you can paint on. For the most part, you're pretty much limited to paper here. Additionally, depending on the kind of painter you are, your materials can go from just a nice thing to have to a necessity. Something like masking fluid, for example, depending on how you paint, that could just become another expense that kind of comes up every time. And additionally, the right type of paper, the paper you like, maybe that be something cheap or something expensive, that becomes another essential thing to your process. Watercolors also have a limited wet working time. Like you think, okay, we can just reactivate them with water. You can on the palette. On the paper, it only goes so far. A lot of times when you start scrubbing in a lot of paint and a lot of extra water into stuff that's already dried, you start to damage the paper. It just only lifts so much. So like any painting medium, watercolors definitely aren't for everyone. Granted, I'm not the best with watercolors, but I feel like what I can do with them kind of speaks for itself. I use them a lot of times in my mixed media work, and to create that bright, vibrant base color and then work on top of that, I think is really cool. So at the end of all of this, what brands do I really recommend? If you're just starting out, something like Grumbacher Academy or Winsor & Newton Cottonman are actually really solid choices. Additionally, believe it or not, a pan of Crayolas, not a bad choice. Now for the artists and professional grade watercolors that I recommend, I'm just going to throw a list in here because it would take too long to mention all of them. I do want to note though that the Da Vinci watercolors are actually a student grade paint, but they actually hold up really well, really alongside any of the ones on this list. Also, the Van Gogh colors are really good, especially in the pan and cake style watercolors. I should also make note that if you buy a tube watercolor and an empty pan, you can create your own custom pan watercolors just by squirting out parts of the tubes and then taking it with you on the go. Now granted, there are a lot of other watercolor brands, and I'm probably forgetting a few, but remember, what works well for you is the one you should use. So this was actually a remake of an earlier Everything You Need to Know About Watercolors video I did, but I feel like I covered a lot more stuff here. So I hope you learned something. If you did, hit the like button, get subscribed, and this has been from DMC Films, Cinderblock Studios. See you guys next time.